This happened in the summer of 2008, I think. I was at a sleepover birthday party at my friend's house. That is going to require some explanation. I live in rural, western Pennsylvania. All you need to know about that side of the state is that if you aren't living in Pittsburgh and Erie, you're probably living in an oil town that went bust years ago. Oh, and you're probably isolated in a forest somewhere too. My family did okay in spite of the economically depressed area we lived in. Now, my friend had money though. His family weren't Wall Street investors or anything, but in a town like mine, it was noticeable. He had a big house, a huge yard, a tree house, a trampoline, big screen TVs everywhere, and every video game console ever. You might think I was only friends with this kid because of the stuff he had, but honestly, that isn't true. He's probably in the top 5 nicest people I've ever met. His family is also amazing. They took me in for a while when my mom was in the hospital once. I still keep in touch with them. So, rich guy, good guy, etc. He had a lot of friends as well. His birthday parties were pretty legendary among kids in our town. Usually, they involved one of those closed canopy tents outside with movie projectors inside along with soft serve ice cream and a slushie machine. The party in 2008, I think he was turning 14 and I was 13, was a little more low-key. There were a few less people than normal and there weren't any tents and projectors. We played video games for the first part of the night and then started to play flashlight tag when it got dark. I know that the rules to flashlight tag can vary depending on who's playing. My friends and I used to play it like group hide and seek. The hiders would go hide in the dark, and sometimes alone. The seekers got the flashlight and also some cool walkie-talkies. As I said before, the yard we played in was huge, and there were a lot of places to hide. The first hour or so was pretty uneventful. We mostly hid around the treehouse, as well as climbing some of the trees inside the yard itself. The only thing we had to worry about was when a cop car drove by. Obviously, we weren't doing anything illegal, but we just didn't want to explain why we were sneaking around a house at 11 at night with flashlights. My friend's yard ends in some pretty thick woods. My own house, which is a couple miles down the road, has some wooded areas around it as well, but not like this. After you leave my friend's backyard, there's about 15 to 20 miles of wilderness before the next town. He does have neighbors on one side, and all of this is going to become important in a little bit. On this particular time, I was one of the seekers. My group and I were waiting in the house for the other group to hide. We were mostly drinking slushies and messing around. We had just come out of the house and started our search when we heard a lot of yelling suddenly. The entire group came rushing back to the house. They went inside, and my group, really confused at this point, followed them in. It took a few minutes for everyone to calm down and explain what was happening. Their story went like this. That round, they had all decided to hide back in the woods since we wouldn't have been back there yet. They had gone a number of places inside, but were still in sight of the house. Looking farther inside the woods, they caught a slight figure at the edge of their vision. It took them a little while to figure out what they were looking at in the dark. They thought it might be a tree or a deer or something, but they kept focusing on it. when they were sure that the shape was human, they started yelling and sprinting back to the house. When everyone was finally inside and mostly settled down, I was freaking out along with them. A few of the people in my group, including my friend who was throwing the party, were skeptical. They were pretty sure that the other group was just trying to scare us. In fact, my friend was almost angry about it. He was going to march off to the woods to check the situation out himself. They stopped him and said they should only go back to check as a group or to wake up his parents who were asleep upstairs. Most of the people who hadn't gone into the woods actually found this to be pretty fun in a weird way. It was like being in a thriller movie. Plus, we were in a low-crime neighborhood, and there were enough of us that one unarmed person shouldn't have been a bother. Even if it was a hoax, it would have been a fun scare. We came up with a plan to investigate the woods. The majority of the guys decided to go back into the woods with flashlights and walkie-talkies. They also planned to bring my friend's dog, but that didn't work out. The dog was a golden retriever collie mix and was the furthest thing from a guard dog, unless you feared being licked to death. He also got most of his exercise by fetching tennis balls in the big yard, so he was not going to be a good lead on a leash. I waited at the house with another scaredy cat with the other walkie-talkie, ready to wake up my friend's parents in order to call the cops. I wasn't taking the situation very well, but didn't really show it. I tend to seem pretty calm on the outside when I'm usually a nervous wreck on the inside. I at least attempted to calm the other scaredy cat down. After a few minutes and some excited chatter on the walkie-talkie, the investigators returned in a similar state as the original first group. There was a lot of shouting, and it took a few minutes to get the story straight. This is what happened to them. They had gone to the edge of the woods like the original first group had done. It took a few minutes of searching since the figure had been spotted in the thicker brush that wasn't easy to reach. One of the kids had swung his flashlight around until he caught sight of something before yelling and running back to the house. Some of the other boys who had gotten the same glimpse inside the flashlight beam behaved similarly. They confirmed that they had seen a person. He was mostly obscured behind a small tree. The features that they could make out from the brief moment were that of a male who was on the taller side with longish hair. One of the boys who had seen him thought he might have been wearing some light flannel. Apparently, he had made no move to approach them and had just cocked his head out a little to stare them down, out from behind the tree. It was at this point that my friend's mom finally came downstairs after all the commotion. We explained the situation to her. Afterwards, she locked all the doors and told us to stay inside and to tell her if we saw anything. She explained that that part of the woods we were going into was probably not their land anyway. Needless to say, I did not sleep well that night. We were situated on an air mattress in my friend's game room. The really frightened kid actually took to sleeping underneath one. Just before sunrise, I finally drifted off for a few hours. When I came to, everyone else was awake eating pancakes on the patio. My friend's mom was with them. She had checked the woods that morning and had not seen anything amiss. We were all a little on edge, but things were pretty normal besides that. When my parents came to pick me up, I was reminded of the fact that I only lived about 2 miles from my friend's house. It was a walk that took 10 minutes or less. Even at home, I struggled to sleep for a while. I just kept thinking of how easy it would be for the man in the woods to show up in my yard. Fast forward a couple weeks later, and I'm playing video games at my friend's house again. I bring up the subject, but he was very dismissive of it. It was strange, but he was really short with me. It was like he wanted me to drop it. None of his behavior fit normal. He did come up with a short explanation, though. Apparently, one of his neighbors had a son a few years older than us. He was tall with long hair. My friend explained that he could be a jerk and was pretty weird. The way he said weird may have indicated some mental condition. My friend's explanation was that this kid had seen us playing and hid in the woods to scare us. That did make me feel a little better at first. It did seem reasonable on the surface, and there's a good chance that's actually what happened. However, there's a few things that don't sit right with me. In my experience, when someone is trying to scare you, there's a ha-ha got ya moment in the end. Like, most people want to reveal that whole thing was a good nature and they were just messing around. Back when we had our sleepovers in tents, one of my friend's older brothers would rustle the outside before popping in to see if he had scared us. Both of his brothers had moved out of the house by the night of the incident. This person in the woods did nothing like that. He may have just been trying to scare us and went all in on the whole thing. Or this kid really did have problems. Maybe he just didn't understand how pranks typically went. His explanation also brought back an old memory of mine. I'd been going to my friend's house for close to 10 years at this point. In one of the early years, I remember playing a game with my friend and one of his neighbors who lived across the street. Both my friend and the neighbor had crabapple trees in their yards. We played a game of basically dodgeball with moldy apples thrown across the road. The game ended when the neighbor, who was a few years older, chucked a crabapple at my friend's head as hard as he could. It absolutely nailed my friend and he was on the ground crying. I brought him inside where his parents asked him what was wrong. I told him about the game and the neighbor kid. When he finished crying, his parents scolded him and said that they had warned him about this. They just said that the neighbor kid was not nice. For the record, the neighbor kid at the time did not have long hair, but this was a number of years prior to the incident. Now, I don't know if this was the neighbor that my friend had pinned the blame on, which brings me to some other disturbing things. My friend never gave me the suspect's name, even when I pressed him on it. More unsettling was the fact that my friend was not among the kids who had actually seen the guy directly. This was just his explanation for what happened. I don't think my friend was actually trying to cover anything. I think he was just worried that I wouldn't want to come to his house anymore if I didn't feel safe. This was the last time I had a sleepover at my friend's house. That wasn't really because of the incident, but because we were entering high school and overnight parties started to mean something else entirely. My friend's explanation does seem plausible, and that makes a pretty creepy story on its own. The alternatives are even more frightening. I don't even want to think about what kind of guys go stalk teenagers in the woods in the middle of the night. So, Whether you were a creepy neighbor or a creepy mystery person, let's not meet again.